Welcome folks, I got another great encounter for you now. It's raining like crazy outside, so I have to do this from inside. Okay, here we go. The day the old German man arrived in our village changed our lives forever. A flotilla of never-ending craft, the likes that we had never seen before, carrying supplies after supplies. The river had never been so busy, particularly this far into the forest. My father and all the men of the village would be employed for the next year in building the large stone house that the butterfly man would call home. First in clearing a large swathe of forest, and then in the building of the house under the supervision of the Brazilian architect. A translator had been hired to assist him in directing my father and the other local men, as their Portuguese was limited, to say the least. Us kids called the old German man the butterfly man, as he would reward us with delicious sweets from his homeland that were like nothing we had ever tasted before when we would bring him a butterfly. Sometimes he would go with us into the forest, but mainly he would stay in his large temporary tent structure that was his home when his house was being built. There he would use all sorts of shiny objects to dissect the butterflies, and us kids would stand mesmerized watching on. He would document each butterfly in his book and could expertly draw and color each one. We would often ask him why he was doing this, and his reply, through his translator, was always the same. Children, nature is wonderful and holds secrets that man can only dream about. His now constructed stone house, with its slated roof and magic lighting, as we called it, was a far cry from our modest mud hut dwellings. We were Tahena people, some full-blooded and some, like my father, a mixture of Tahena and Portuguese settler ancestry. We still dressed like our ancestors and had continued their way of life. Hunters, fishermen and small farmers is what we were, and the forest and river provided everything we needed. The men of the village would make the long journey down river to the town where the four rivers came together to sell fish and animal hides. In return, they would bring the necessities that we had become to depend on from the outside world, something that saddened my grandmother, as she saw it as the continuing erosion of her true way of life. She did, however, find it very amusing the time my father brought a gift to my mother from the butterfly man, a beautiful white European dress and a mirror. We all laughed as my mother struggled to put it on, but eventually she got the hang of it, and she looked so beautiful. Other men had brought similar dresses for their wives, and they were all worn on the evening of the large party to commemorate the building of the butterfly man's house. A huge banquet of European and of our traditional food was laid out with European-style sweets and cakes that had us kids in delirium. I had never seen my mother or the other village women struggle to walk before, but it was explained to me that the grape juice they were drinking caused this, something that only the adults were allowed to drink. We had quite the time trying to help my father walk my mother downhill to our home. Once inside, my mother was begging for my father to return and get more of the adult grape juice, but my father kept saying that she would only suffer more from the headache that was coming her way in the morning. My father and the men of the village, it seemed, had built up more of a tolerance to the adult grape juice from their many campfire sittings with the butterfly man during the construction of his house. My grandmother didn't see the funny side of it and kept asking my father why nobody was allowed to go to the bottom floor of the house. My father replied that it was a special laboratory, having to then explain to her just what a laboratory actually was, and that only the Germans could enter there. He said the closest he had got into seeing it was when he was helping to bring inside the large pieces of equipment. A laboratory for what, she said. I replied, for butterflies, of course. My father laughed and replied that the butterfly collecting was just his hobby, and in fact the butterfly man was a doctor, and that he had even treated some of the men who had felt ill at various times during the house construction, and even had a special powder that when mixed with water could help quell those morning headaches that the European alcohol brought on. My grandmother was furious when he said this. Why do you think the medicine man has stayed away from our village? I'll tell you, she said, it's because of that man. Why do we need a doctor? The medicine man is our doctor, just like his father, grandfather and great-grandfather before him. He is of a pure heart, at one with the forest. What illness have they ever failed to cure? The forest always cures us, and they are the forest. It is his relationship with them that makes him the medicine man he is. He is jealous of the German, my father replied, and has been from the beginning. Not once has he accepted an invitation to come and to meet him. Even when we try and bring the German to meet him, he has already gone hiding into the forest. Jealous, my grandmother said. The medicine man knows nothing of that word. The German is infecting our way of life. All the drinking and whatever other substances you and the rest of the men are taking up there. You don't even fish on the best days anymore, just relying on his handouts. Not this again, my father said, shouting at my grandmother to tell me her special story, as only a child would believe her, as he left to return to the German's house. The Germans laugh at our stories about the forest people, and especially yours, he shouted. My mother had long since passed out on her bed as I looked at my grandmother. Who are they you refer to as being the forest? I asked. Let's get you cleaned up first for bed and I'll tell you, she said. As I lay in bed, my grandmother began telling me her story. She began, when I was not much younger than you, I became very ill, and the then medicine man, his father, tried everything he had, but my illness grew worse. On the 4th day, I was carried deep inside the forest, slipping in and out of consciousness as the men carried me. With the medicine man, I remember, always a distance in front. Then he stopped and raised his arm. He walked back and the men placed me in his arms. He told the men to make camp there and that he would bring me alone the rest of the way. We came to a small clearing and he laid me on the forest floor. I remember him putting his medicine on a leaf to my side. He started humming and the humming sound started coming back from the forest all around us. Out of nowhere a huge figure stood over me, his huge foot next to my face. I looked up as the giant frame blocked out the sky from my view. He knelt down and started to gently rub my forehead with the ends of his huge fingers. He and the medicine man started to hum. I started to feel better, then worse, as the plants beside me began to wither, then recover, as if mirroring what I was feeling. Then as soon as the giant figure had arrived, he was gone. The medicine beside me on the leaf now had some new ingredients, what looked like some mushrooms and tree bark that I had never seen before. The medicine man began to prepare the new medicine, busily mixing it up all together and mushing it into a watery pulp. He sat me up and I drank it. My temperature left me immediately and I began to feel better. But who are these giants? I asked. They are the forest and the forest is them, she said, as I couldn't fight to sleep any longer. The arguments in our home became commonplace after that time, with my father spending more and more time in the German's house. I would always be sent outside by my grandmother as she would hear my father approaching our home as daylight would break. I would always greet my father as he would arrive, his bloodshot eyes and strange scent, something my friends would also speak about of their fathers. Then the arguments would start, that I would try to block out by placing my hands over my ears. As they became a daily occurrence, I stopped trying to block them out. Women were being brought from the town where the 4 rivers joined to entertain the men at these nightly parties. My first thoughts as a child was that these women were musicians or cooks of some sort. But after hearing my mother and grandmother scream at my father, I began to understand just what entertainment they were really providing. The nightly parties stopped as the men of the village were tasked with a new project. A trail wide enough for 2 horses and carts was to be built deep into the forest. The men spent the next few months clearing the forest in way of the new trail. To quicken the process, more horses and donkeys were brought in, and the Germans would use explosives to remove the giant roots of the trees. They would clear one section, then return to the river where paving stones were being shipped up to the village. After the trail had been finished, more outside people started to arrive to the German's house. Us children were told not to touch, as the adults carried the boxes of what I would later know to be guns and ammunition up to the German's house. Large tents like those the German man had originally stayed in were put up where all those new strangers would stay in. Loud noises would be heard throughout the day as the men of the village, including my father, were trained in how to use the guns and ammunition by the new strangers. These are not doctors, my father would say at night. They are bred for war. When my mother and grandmother would ask why this was happening, my father's only response was, maybe the German man has enemies and he needs protection. Then he looked at my grandmother. "The medicine man," he said. "He only talks about the medicine man now. We tracked him down, but he keeps saying the same thing, that the forest will cast you all out if you continue going against it." It had been months since the German man had called for us children, but we all ran up the hill with excitement, as we knew those delicious sweets would surely be coming our way. We had already caught for him just about every kind of butterfly in our part of the forest, so we were a little surprised when he asked us again, as the particular butterfly type he wanted were just about everywhere you looked. It didn't take us long to arrive back to him, a butterfly from each of the children. Those sweets sure did taste well, and we all speculated whether we would be looking for more butterflies in the days to come. The next morning the village was in a state of panic as 2 of my friends became seriously ill. My grandmother, amongst others, suggested for them to be immediately taken to the medicine man. Others said he was now too far into the forest, while others, like my father, called for them to be taken to the German's house. The 2 were eventually taken to the German's house, where the old German man and another person, who was introduced as also being a doctor, began assessing the children. The translator told us all to wait outside to let the doctors do their work. After an hour or so went by, the old German man, or butterfly man as we continued calling him, came out. We could see in his face that things were not good. He said in our language, "Medicine man," and then began explaining to the translator. "They don't have the medicines here needed, and it will take too much time to get them to the village. They have slowed down their infections for now, but we must act. They must be taken to the medicine man," the translator said. 2 men went ahead into the forest to find the medicine man, while my 2 friends were taken by a group of men, including my father, into the forest. The butterfly man insisted to go, albeit against the wishes of some of the villagers, including my grandmother, but the men allowed him, saying it could only help having 2 doctors. It was, however, strange to everyone that 2 of these strangers that had just arrived to the village also went, and with both carrying guns. The 2 men who first went ahead met the main group and said that the medicine man was at his second hut in the forest. They reached his hut, and the 2 children were brought inside, with the butterfly man and the 2 strangers waiting outside. Daylight was fast disappearing as the men made camp outside the medicine man's hut, while inside the medicine man continued trying to cure the children's illnesses. The men sat around the fire outside, the butterfly man now asleep under his white hat as the early hours of the morning passed. As daylight broke, he was awoken by his translator. "The medicine man cannot cure him. Can you help?" the translator said. The butterfly man went inside as the men and medicine man spoke. "The forest is not there to cure them now," the medicine man said. "My father, who had never believed my grandmother's story, believing her to be delusional at the time due to her sickness, began to grow agitated with the medicine man's assertions about the forest. The butterfly man looked at the medicine man, respectfully waiting for his approval. The medicine man motioned for him to approach. The butterfly man began to examine the children. He gave them 2 injections, again repeating, just like before, that his medicine would only slow the infection down. They all returned to sitting around the fire while the medicine man remained inside. After a short time, the medicine man let out a cry. They all rushed inside as the children's condition began to improve. "It was your medicine that worked," the men said to the butterfly man. He shook his head and pointed to the medicine man. The men started thanking the medicine man, but the medicine man appeared unsure, almost like he didn't believe it himself. The butterfly man declared that a great feast would be held the next night in the honor of the medicine man. The medicine man, after many pleas from the men, eventually accepted. Everyone was in great spirits the following night in the butterfly man's house. Even my grandmother was in good spirits, owing to the fact that the medicine man had agreed to come. My mother, remembering her throbbing headache from the previous occasion, held back on the adult grape juice. As the evening wore on, and with no sign of the medicine man, concerns started to grow. Some felt that he had never intended to go, whilst others felt something was wrong. Men left to try and locate him, while the mood of the evening quickly turned to one of worry. I remember hearing gasps as they returned later, carrying the medicine man. He was found lying on the forest floor, halfway between his first hut and the village. He was barely responsive and clearly feeling the effects of a high fever, but different from the illness that had affected my 2 friends. The butterfly man and his compatriot assessed him and quickly came to the same conclusion as with my 2 friends. People tried questioning the medicine man, asking him what medicine they needed to get from his hut to cure him. In order to save time, 2 men set off to his hut to bring back all of his medicines. The medicine man eventually managed a coherent sentence in between his bouts of unconsciousness. He said that none of his medicine would work and that the forest was not there to help him. Everybody started to panic. "What do we do now?" they said. "How can we help him?" My grandmother spoke up, saying he needed to be taken to the forest people. "He said the forest people can't help him," some shouted, whilst others agreed with my grandmother, citing that there was no other option. The butterfly man clapped his hands loudly, getting everyone's attention. "Into the forest we will go then. It is the only way that we can save them," he said through the translator. My father and some of the men looked confused, as the butterfly man had always laughed off their stories of the forest people. The sounds of horses and carts could be heard outside, with the recently arrived strangers busily loading guns and supplies. How could they have organized everything so fast, my mother said. The men, including my father, would leave shortly, the butterfly man in the last cart, tending to the medicine man with the other doctor. They rode through the night, nearing the end of the trail just before midday. The medicine man was still in a critical condition as the translator instructed the men to move into the forest. They were joined by what everyone in the village had now come to acknowledge as being the Germans man's guards, their rifles always on their shoulders. The men wondered what the thick rope netting they were carrying was for as they came to a clearing. The guards began to survey the perimeter of the clearing, then started to use hand motions as if planning out what they expected to happen. The men then were put to work in felling small trees, their trunks and branches then cut and made into sharpened stakes. Some of the men were then sent to gather dried grass, while others returned to the carts to bring the barrels of the fuel that the German man used in his home light-making machine, or what I now know to have been a generator. The stakes were placed all around the perimeter except in one corner. The guards then started to soak the stakes with the generator fuel after the men had lined the perimeter with the dried grass. My father began to think if the Germans actually did believe in the forest people, as he still didn't. He always thought it was the medicine men's ways of making themselves out to be more important, and it was all one big myth. Perhaps it was the Portuguese blood in him, he would often say. "Why are we making the medicine man suffer longer by bringing him all the way into the forest?" the men started to say. The translator told the men to return to the main group to eat, as it would soon be dark, and it was then when the medicine man would be brought to the clearing. As darkness set in, all the group started returning to the clearing. Some of the men had already been instructed to light small fires to light up the way. When they arrived to the clearing, a small fire was already ablaze, marking the center of the clearing. The medicine man was brought to the center and placed near the fire. The men were told to leave the clearing and join the rest outside. They all hunkered down, being told not to make noises as the guards stared at the one opening. The only noises that were heard were the typical forest noises, and every so often the medicine man would let out a withering groan. Then a loud whooping noise could be heard, followed by another one in quick succession. The guards began to cock their rifles, while the translator told my father and the other men to ready the rope netting. It had now been minutes since the whooping noises, as everyone peered through the openings of the criss-crossed wooden stakes. Everyone gasped, my father said, as the heavily pregnant female entered the clearing, exactly at the location that they had left open. She walked a little distance inside, then began to look around her before continuing in the direction of the medicine man. Then the ground shook as the female was joined by another creature who appeared to land just beside her. The men looked and pointed to the joined trees that were overhanging the opening, the translator putting his finger over his mouth, making sure everyone kept silent. The two creatures were massive, my father would recall, with monkey-like faces. And as we are not tall people in stature, he could only compare their heights to the butterfly man, who was very tall compared to us. He described the female as being another head over the butterfly man, so I would estimate her as being close to 7 feet. The male was not as tall, maybe a half head smaller than the female. Looked younger but was wider and heavier looking. They were covered in hair except for the face and near their hands and feet. The two creatures approached the medicine man and the female dropped to her knees, putting her hand on the medicine man's forehead while the male stood watching on. She let out a cry and looked up at the male. My father said it looked like the male was trying to get her to leave, as he would walk a little distance and then return when the female remained by the medicine man. A man tapped my father's shoulder, as with him being so transfixed on the two creatures, he hadn't noticed the guards and the other village men already on the move. They were moving around to the entrance of the clearing, while two other men stayed next to the butterfly man and the other doctor. With everyone in position, the hand signal was given, and fire began to encircle the opening. My father could not see, but he recalls hearing the creatures roaring, with the male and female's roars being distinct from one another. The men started firing their guns upwards as the roars of the creatures intensified. My father heard loud gasps coming from the men near the opening. The male creature, it seemed, had leapt from the ground to the branches of the large overhanging trees, clearing the 8-foot-tall burning wooden stakes in the process, a feat no human could ever dream of doing. The female's roars turned to cries as my father had now made it to the opening, as the male continued calling for her to join him in the tree. She looked unsure, continuing to look around as if trying to find another exit. Then the horrifying scene unfolded as the heavily pregnant female leapt, and although clearing the burning stakes, the branch she gripped couldn't hold her, and she fell back into the burning inferno below. The screams of the female now filled the night air as her huge burning frame ran from side to side. Nobody knew what to do, even the guards looked horrified. She began rolling on the forest floor, frantically grabbing leaves and dirt. The smell of burning hair and flesh filled everyone's nostrils as the smouldering body of the female lay on the ground, her screams still audible but getting fainter and fainter. The gunshots started again as the male leapt back down, alternating between roaring at the men and crying for what my father had become to believe was his mother. My father watched as two of the guards sneaked along the perimeter. They had a different type of gun with them, and not one that my father had been trained with. He couldn't hear the shots from the male's roars and cries, but the male began to stagger and then dropped to the ground. He was deeply sedated, the translator would say later, and they had to move fast. It took the strength of nearly every man just to get each creature onto the strapped cradles that the guards had brought in one of their carts. These were then pulled by horses until the carts. The female was still breathing as she was pulled up onto the cart, always clutching her belly. The medicine man didn't make it, my father said, and was left in the middle of the clearing, this being against the wishes of the villagers who had wanted to bring him back to bury him. The guard said that he would become part of the forest, just as he had lived, although the look on the translator's face when he communicated this to the men, coupled with the guard's smirks, showed to the village men their true feelings. It was dark when they arrived back in the village, and the sounds of horses approaching had all the villagers waiting outside the butterfly man's house. My mother, grandmother, and I were amongst them. We didn't see the creatures as the horses and carts went directly into the courtyard before the large gate was shut behind. That foul smell of burning flesh, as my father would later comment on from the events of the forest, filled the air. It would be my father who would tell us of the events that unfolded inside, as all the men of the village were sworn to secrecy, to talk of nothing that had happened in the forest or what was brought back to the village with them. They were told in no uncertain terms that if one word got out from any of them, that all the villagers, not just their own families, would be killed. The medicine man could not be cured. There was no forest people, and his last dying words were for him to be buried in the forest. This is what they were told to say. He and the other men, along with the guards, brought the creatures into the house. A large opening with pulleys and ropes that the men had never remembered seeing during the construction of the house was used to bring the creatures down to the bottom floor. The male and female were put in separate rooms, with the male being given another tranquilizer dart upon entry. It was the female they were interested in, or more importantly, her unborn baby. The butterfly man shouted, and the guards put extra straps around her arms and legs. He took out a large knife-like object and started cutting into her belly. The blood-gurgling screams of the female sent shivers through the onwatching men as blood started to quickly cover the floor. The translators shouted for my father and the men to mop the blood up. As my father was on his knees trying to contain the endless streams of blood, the first cries of the baby could be heard. The men rose to their feet as the German man held the baby, the umbilical cord still attached. It was just like a human baby, my father recalled, a little baby girl. The female's eyes followed her newborn as it was brought to the side, the whites of her eyes in stark contrast to her charred face, while the blood continued to flow from her open belly. The baby's cries began to wither until eventually there were none. My father watched as the female took her last breath. It was as if her maternal instinct had kept her alive right until the last breath of her baby. My father didn't know what the Germans did with the corpses, as that was the last time he was inside the house. The closest he had gotten was a short time after, when he helped open the gate for the arrival of 5 young women, all of them appearing as not being present, as how he described them, given how they had to be walked into the house. My father and all the men of the village would work shifts, guns in hands, along with the guards, morning, noon and night. The butterfly man and the other doctor were rarely seen in these months, and the parties were a thing of the past. Us villagers would often wonder what the strange howling cries were coming from the German man's house each night. My father would later tell us that the screams of the women and of the male creature that the men would hear daily made them wonder just what horrors were going on inside. The months passed by and the night arrived when my father would tell us everything that what was going on. The crying, howling noises, now a common nightly occurrence and one we no longer questioned, could be heard once more. My father had arrived home from a shift at the butterfly man's house. He sat down, and after one of the howls could be heard, he just said, with a blank, expressionless look on his face, "Forest people, that is one of them." He proceeded to tell us everything, and over the coming days he had planned for our family to escape from the village. We would all leave during the night on the following week. We would trek through the forest downriver until out of sight of the village, where my father would have hidden a canoe on the river bank. I still remember the night that my father's plans for our escape would end. It was the night before we had planned to leave. I woke up as my mother and grandmother were looking outside. "Did you hear it? It's getting closer," my grandmother said. I went and stood beside them, and I too began to hear it. Every time the young male would let out his crying howls, others would respond, and each time they would appear closer and closer. "It is the forest," my grandmother said. "What?" my mother replied. "Their medicine man, the forest people. He wasn't there. It all makes sense. That is why the medicine man said that the forest is not there. He meant him. But now he is, and he is coming for the young male, his son." The roars began to shake the inside of our hut as gunshots from the butterfly man's house could be heard. My mother tried to leave to warn my father, but it was too late and we pulled her back. We lay on the floor as the screams of the men and gunshots could be heard, followed by what sounded like the huge gate of the butterfly man's house being crushed in. I started crying, thinking about my father and the other men of the village. We all stayed huddled together on the floor, our cries somehow leading to sleep as the carnage outside continued. I awoke first and took those first steps outside, which will live with me forever. My father was there, well, part of him, as his head faced me, it having been impaled on a sharpened stake. I looked to my side as the heads of all the village men were similarly placed outside of their homes. None of the guards protecting the butterfly man's house had survived. There were many of these huge creatures, as one of the villagers had watched them leave with 3 screaming, very heavily pregnant women in their arms. The sounds of a boat motor had also been heard during the night, but it was not the butterfly man who had escaped. No, he was still alive, if you could call it that. He was fixed, as if floating against the stones of his house above the battered-in gate. For 3 days and 3 nights his cries could be heard as his smouldering body dripped, with a pool of liquid blood gathering below him. Some villagers tried to get him down, but as they got closer, they too started to feel the sensation of being on fire. On the 4th day, he fell to the ground, his skeleton only remaining on the blood-stained earth, and above the blackish-red bodily impression, further accentuated by the surrounding white stones, and a permanent reminder left for all to see. The river dried up of fish, and the forest no longer provided for us. We left and settled in the town where the 4 rivers met. My mother, still a young woman at the time, remarried, but never could conceive another child, a fate that befell all of the women of the village. It was with great joy and trepidation in years to come when my wife would break the news to me that we were having a baby. We went on to have 5 children. It seems the curse of the forest people had not been passed to us children. Wow, there you go, folks. That is an incredibly sad story, but very, very interesting. I hope you liked it. Basically, I got all the main points of that in Portuguese, and I had to fill in some bits and pieces and tell it from the child's perspective. So I hope you all like the way I told the story. And yeah, this one, when you hear it first and you start thinking about it, it's very sad what happened. Excuse this, I'm gonna show you this.